Hey folks, I'm just going to record the last part of Module 2 lectures, just in case we don't get through it all this week, because we do have our test on Friday. So let's start with epigenetics. So this is a field that looks at how the environment actually affects which genes get expressed and when and how. For example, they look at things like living under stress and how that can activate certain genes for disease, or consuming a poor diet. Same thing, right? So those are lifestyle factors that can interact with which genes are actually going to be switched on. And recent research shows that changes in how genes are expressed can be passed on to future generations. Just going to start my timer here. I want these video clips to be about 20 minutes. So, for example, they did this interesting study where they got some pregnant rats, and they had a group that was stressed on a daily basis while they were pregnant. And this is how you stress a rat often in the research. It's kind of mean, but you put them on this little pedestal surrounded by water. And there go my cats. And they don't like it, right? So their heart rate is up. They have stress hormones coursing through their body. So we know that they're stressed out when they're in this situation. And what they found was that the baby rats that were born to these stressed pregnant rats ended up being more sensitive to stressors than other rats. So it's like something tags the genes that tell them when to express, and that can be like passed on to the next generation. So in humans, we talk about things like, generational trauma, where the stressor gets passed on to the children, and they have different genes activated. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how nurture can influence nature, right? How life experiences can affect our systems. So there's this interesting case, Michelle Mack. There she is here. So when she was 27, she had to go to the doctor for something. They did a CAT scan and discovered, to everybody's shock, that she was missing half her brain, right? So this empty space here should be filled with brain, but it isn't. So they figured it's probably like she had a stroke when she was in the womb that killed off a bunch of brain. Now, if this happened to you as an adult, you would probably die, right? There'd be devastating losses here. But because it happened prenatally, all this remaining brain tissue is super plastic, super flexible, right? And so it managed to kind of take up the slack and figure out the job of whatever this brain part would have been, right? So, she has small deficits in language and in like motor skills, but nothing huge, nothing that got her to the doctor, right? Her right hemisphere was able to take over language functions, the right side of the body control. It's an amazing example of plasticity. Okay. So speaking of plasticity, plasticity refers to the ability of the brain to respond to the demands that are made of it. So our brains are changing continually. We can talk about 3 ways. One is that, our brains can grow new neurons and also form new connections among existing neurons. So this ability decreases as we get older, but even when we're old, our brains can grow new connections among neurons and even grow new neurons, something called neurogenesis. And neurogenesis happens most reliably in young brains, so fetal and early childhood. Growing new neuronal connections is the biological basis for learning, right? Like every time you learn some new thing, neurons are connecting up that weren't connected before, right? So at the end of this lecture, you're going to have a brain that is slightly differently wired than you had at the start. Second way that the brain is plastic, changing existing neural connections. So every time 2 neurons talk to each other, it gets easier and easier for them to talk to each other. This is how and why practicing, studying, this is how they have an effect, right? You're making the same neurons speak over and over and over again, and it's getting easier and easier and easier for them to do that. Third big way is like what happened with Michelle Mack, where she suffered a brain injury and new connections can develop between nearby brain regions, taking over the function of the damaged area. Now, this is going to happen more readily and more completely in younger brains, like Michelle Mack. Her injury happened probably before she was born. The older we get, the less we will bounce back from things like a stroke, right? Okay. So now we move on to the chapter 3 material. Consciousness, right? This is the fancy stuff the brain can do. So consciousness is your moment by moment awareness of your experiences of the world around you and your own thoughts, feelings, and actions, right? So consciousness is about like being aware of the world out there, but also being aware of what's going on in your own mind and in your own body. Our experience of consciousness varies, right? So it's, William James said it's like a stream of consciousness. It's constantly changing. In any particular moment, you might be conscious of some things, unconscious of others. And our experience of consciousness varies because our awareness varies, right? Like you could be reading a book and not be aware, that somebody entered the room. You could be not thinking about how your shoes feel on your feet until somebody mentions it, right? So we can understand consciousness in terms of our state of awareness. There's the normal waking state, which is where we have a clear kind of awareness of the outside world and of our own internal mental activities. And then there are altered states, right? So an altered state is any deviation from the normal waking state, including sleep, right? This is a cool little visual that sort of shows all the different altered states that are possible. So a little peek back at how we understand consciousness. You go back a couple of centuries, 4 centuries, there was the mind-body problem that philosophers were grappling with. Philosophers like Rene Descartes here. So the mind-body problem is this: if we are a physical body plus an immaterial soul, right, then how does the soul interact with the physical body? They believe that the soul included, like your consciousness, right? Your sense of who you are, the little voice in your head that keeps you company, right? Consciousness and soul were kind of interchangeable concepts. So like if I think, raise your left arm and my left arm goes up, the philosopher is interested in how did that happen? How does an immaterial, non-physical soul interact with the physical body? Right? Anyway, that's the mind-body problem. Rene Descartes chewed on that a fair bit, and he believed that the mind is separate from the brain and the body. So this is called dualism, the idea that there is a separate immaterial something, and then there's our physical body. Now, in the modern day, most psychologists are not dualists because we have an awful lot of evidence that the brain seems to be creating the mind. It's not that the brain is housing the mind like a radio gets radio waves. It's that the brain itself is creating the mind. So we don't need to posit some extra thing like an immaterial soul. So this is called the materialism model, right? The mind and the body are inseparable, according to this view. The brain is creating the mind through the firing and functioning of billions of neurons, right? Okay. Here's the psychological theory talking about how, the interaction between consciousness and brain circuitry, right? This is called the global workspace model. So like when you're listening to music, your conscious experience of the music is the result of particular regions in the brain becoming activated at the same time, right? Regions that process sound, regions that process the meaning of the lyrics, your memories of hearing the song before, the emotional state that, these might produce. So no one area of the brain is responsible for your awareness, right? Specific areas process certain types of information. So here was a cool study kind of illustrating this. They showed people images that were like of a face and a house superimposed upon each other, right? So if you're there, if you're in this study, they flash this image at you pretty quickly, and then it disappears, and you need to report on whether you saw the face or the house, right? And what they found was the people who said they had seen a face had activity like in the same region, right? A region that we later learned is about face recognition. Those who said they had seen a house, their brain activity was localized to a part that we later learned is all about like recognizing objects, right? So this tells us that different areas of the brain process different types of sensory information, right? Like the part of the brain that's about face recognition is the same for everyone. The part of the brain that's about object recognition is the same for everyone, right? So we're kind of reaching this point where we can look at brain activity and figure out what the person is thinking about. Patterns of brain activity can reveal things like whether a person is looking at faces, bodies, what emotion they're feeling, whether they were thinking about themselves or a friend, right? So we're learning about what the brain looks like for these different functions. Okay, so people share common patterns of brain activity that provide a window into their conscious experience. So we're on the road to being able to kind of read minds by looking at brain activity. Then there's traumatic brain injury. So this happens when an external trauma, a blow to the head, causes changes in consciousness as well as physical damage to the brain. And TBIs can range from mild to severe. Severe TBIs are responsible for about like 30% of injury deaths. So it's always important to protect your noggin, right? So let's talk about some TBIs. Concussions. This is a TBI caused by a blow to the head. Concussions can have long-term effects, especially if they're kind of repetitive. So teens who suffer concussions, for example, have been found to be at higher risk of developing multiple sclerosis later in life. And the risks and the consequences go up as the number of concussions go up. The repeated effects of multiple TBIs have been associated with the deaths of many athletes. So just Google chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, and see what that says, right? So looking at all these famous athletes who died because of this. And then there's coma, right? A coma can be caused by TBIs as well. So people in comas have a kind of sleep-wake cycle where they can open their eyes and appear to be awake, even track objects with their eyes. And then they have times when they appear to be asleep, but they're generally not responsive to their surroundings, right? Even when they're awake. But some people in comas, we've discovered, are aware of what's going on around them, but they're unable to respond. So how do we know that? Check my timer here. We're good. So a study done in 2006, they asked a woman in a coma. That already sounds weird, right? But they said, they sat beside her bed and they asked her, imagine you're playing tennis, right? And then watching the tennis ball come and go. So her brain activity became quite similar to the patterns of control subjects who were also asked to imagine playing tennis, right? So, her brain activity took on that pattern. So she was thinking about playing tennis. And they went on to evaluate 54 other coma patients in this study. And of the 54, they found 5 who could willfully control brain activity to communicate, right? So it's not everybody in a coma, but there's a subset of people who are aware of what's going on. So some people in comas are conscious, but because they can't make their bodies respond, observers think that they're unconscious. So this is known as a minimally conscious state. Now, most people who fall into coma come out of it within a few days. For some, it might take weeks, and some never come out of it. So if it lasts more than a month, the person is said to have unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. This used to be called vegetative state, but unresponsive wakefulness syndrome has kind of taken over. The longer the state goes on, the less likely it becomes that this person will ever regain consciousness or show normal brain activity. Probably a good place to pause, and then I'm going to pick it up in the next segment right about here.